Good morning. Welcome to this edition of the Lynn Freeland Show. Yes, I am here all by myself. We are practicing social distancing these days, so as a result, no guests here in the studio. So my challenge became, what do I do when I'm by myself on a talk show and I can't have any guests? Well, you may have noticed over the last couple of weeks, I have opened up the vault of the Lynn Freeland Show, sometimes going back recently, sometimes going back, way back. Well, this morning, I am going way back into the vault and bringing you an interview that is really one of those shows that often people ask me, what is my most memorable interview? And I say this one. It was an opportunity that I had to sit down and do an interview, an exclusive interview, with Nelson Mandela. So this is an interview that actually took place back in 1991. Nelson Mandela came to the University of Pittsburgh courtesy of the H.J. Heinz Foundation at the time, and I had a chance to sit down and talk with him. I went to his hotel room with photographer Ken Sims. We did a one-on-one interview, but part of the show we put together that day included an opportunity to review, if you will, who Nelson Mandela was. So let's first look at that story, just who is or who was Nelson Mandela.
Nelson Mandela's involvement in South African protests goes back as far as his college days, when he was expelled for his role in a student strike. But it was not until he co-organized the Youth League of the African National Congress in 1944 that it became clear exactly what Mandela's role in the fight against apartheid would be. Early on in the struggle, Mandela believed that a withdrawal of labor was the only way to overcome the apartheid system. But in his 1964 trial, Mandela said, "All lawful modes of expressing opposition to this principle have been closed by the legislation, and we were placed in a position in which we had to either accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government."
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
At the end of that trial, Nelson Mandela was found guilty of charges of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. So in 1964, Nelson Mandela began a 27-year stay in prison. When he was finally released in 1990, those who brought the man and his cause to the forefront had reason to celebrate.
Well, of course, we were all delighted that he was released from prison. We wore shirts and signs for 2 years saying, "Free Nelson Mandela."
While a lot had changed in Nelson Mandela's time in prison, more has probably changed since his release. Later this month, more than 20 organizations, including the ANC, will meet to lay the groundwork for a new democratic South Africa. While Mandela is asking for a continuance of economic sanctions against his country, the South African government has lifted a ban against the ANC, and many blacks in exile have been allowed to return to their homeland.
The whole sequence of events really links back to Mandela's release and the unbanning of the African National Congress and other organizations.
This is Nelson Mandela's second visit to the United States since his release from prison. But this time, there were no public rallies or ticker tape parades.
There's a normalization in which Mandela now has become a political player, both in his own country and internationally, but in a normalized situation, and he's here this time much more to do business, to have meetings with business people, with potential investors and donors.
But for those who spent years on the picket lines fighting for Nelson Mandela's release, his visit means something quite different.
Amandla, freedom, that's what he stands for. That's what his image speaks. Freedom, not just for South African blacks, but for blacks everywhere.
And of course, many of you may remember that was Barbara Sizemore Mallions. Now, you know, when Nelson Mandela was in prison over the years, I had interviewed his then wife, Winnie Mandela, interviewed his daughters. I mean, this was like an effort that I felt like the whole country was involved in. So to be able to sit down and interview him a year after he was released from prison. You have no idea what that meant. Stick around. I'm going to share that interview with you coming up when the Lynn Hayes Freeland Show continues.